Michael Jordan learns a former opponent died in poverty. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The basketball world in the late 1980s was a stage for some of the fiercest rivalries the sport had ever seen. Michael Jordan, the brash young star from Chicago, was on the rise, but one of the most defining elements of his career was the bitter and relentless battles he faced against some of the league's toughest competitors. One of the most intense rivalries Jordan had, however, wasn't with a teammate or even a future Hall of Famer. It was against a player who was equally determined to make his mark in the NBA. This was a time when every game felt like a showdown. The league was full of individual talent, each player working tirelessly to carve out his legacy. Jordan had always been driven by the idea of pushing himself to the limit, facing challenges head-on. But it was this particular rival, an opponent whose style and tenacity matched Jordan's in every way, that had pushed him the hardest. In every matchup, the tension was palpable, and the media buzzed with excitement over the battle between the two. Fans didn't just watch, they held their breath every time these two athletes squared off. Jordan's rival was a talented, hard-working player who had quickly made a name for himself. He wasn't a flashy player, but he was one who had mastered the subtleties of the game. His defense was tight, his offense unpredictable, and his ability to drive into the paint with determination made him a force to be reckoned with. While Jordan's name was being etched into the history books with every game, this player was quietly making his own impact. He wasn't receiving the same level of attention, but those who watched closely knew his worth. What made their rivalry so compelling was that neither player was willing to give an inch. Every time they met on the court, it was as if their personal battle defined the entire game. The respect between the two was undeniable, but so was the competition. Both wanted to be the best. Both believed that the other was the biggest obstacle standing in their way. The first time they faced off, it was clear that the stakes were higher than just a win or loss. The rookie Jordan was coming into his own, and his rival had been established as one of the league's top players. Each knew that beating the other wasn't just about winning, it was about proving who was the better player. The game was a defensive masterpiece, with both athletes putting their all into each possession. The game went back and forth, filled with jaw-dropping moments from both sides. Ultimately, Jordan's team edged out the victory, but the game had been a warning shot, a glimpse into what would become one of the most talked-about rivalries in basketball history. Their battles continued in the seasons that followed. With every game, the rivalry grew, as did the respect they had for each other. The players pushed each other to be better, knowing that the only way to get ahead was to outwork the other. Jordan's focus was always on the bigger picture, championships, greatness, but he couldn't deny that every time he faced this rival, something else fueled him. It wasn't just about winning the game. It was about proving that he was the one who could overcome the most challenging obstacles. And the other player was, without a doubt, one of those obstacles. Off the court, things were different. There was no animosity or personal vendettas, just a mutual understanding that both players wanted the same thing, greatness. In interviews, they often praised each other's game, acknowledging the strengths that each brought to the floor. But on the court, the battle was fierce. The rivalry had a personal edge to it, an unspoken competition between two men who both wanted to be the best but knew that only one could hold the crown. As the years went by, Jordan's fame grew, his brand expanding beyond basketball, but his rival's story remained quieter, more contained. While Jordan's name was synonymous with success, his rival had trouble keeping his momentum. He struggled with injuries, personal setbacks, and the weight of his own expectations. However, no matter what came his way, he kept fighting, kept playing, and kept challenging Jordan at every turn. But despite his efforts, he was overlooked in favor of the other superstars of the era. While Jordan was securing championships, MVPs, and commercial deals, his rival had to fight harder for every inch of recognition. The final matchup between Jordan and his rival came in a pivotal game, a game that would decide the fate of both teams for the postseason. The energy in the arena was unlike any other. It was not just about the teams. It was about two great players finally going head-to-head in a defining moment. Jordan, with his leadership and his innate ability to perform in the clutch, found himself facing off against the rival one last time. It was a game that would cement one man's legacy and leave the other questioning what could have been. The game was physical, with both players leaving everything on the floor. The rival, now a seasoned veteran, had learned to use his experience to his advantage. Jordan, on the other hand, was at the peak of his powers, knowing that his time in the spotlight wouldn't last forever. They fought through the entire game, trading baskets, blocking shots, and creating opportunities for their teams. The crowd was on the edge of its seat, knowing that this could be one of the most iconic matchups of the decade. As the game neared its final moments, with the score tied and the clock ticking down, the two players were locked in a duel that would go down in history. Jordan drove to the basket, making a move his rival couldn't quite stop. The ball hit the rim, but it wasn't enough. His rival's team grabbed the rebound, and with seconds left, they made the final play. The ball found its way to the rival, who, despite a fierce defense, made a clean shot at the buzzer. It was a shot that won the game for his team, and the rival had finally achieved his long-sought victory over Jordan. The crowd erupted, but for the rookie in Jordan's shoes, this was more than just a loss. It was the culmination of a rivalry that had shaped his career. He had been bested, but in that moment, Jordan respected his opponent more than ever. The game was over, but the respect between the two players had only deepened. Jordan understood now what it meant to be tested by someone who wasn't just a rival, but a true competitor. But this would be the last time Jordan and his rival faced off. Soon after, the rival faded from the spotlight, his name slipping into the background as the NBA continued to evolve. Jordan, now firmly established as the greatest of all time, would go on to lead the Bulls to more championships. But there was always something about the rivalry, the respect and challenge his opponent had provided, that Jordan couldn't forget. And so, the story of the forgotten rival began. But it would be a story that Jordan could never let go of, because the impact that player had on him was real, deep, and lasting. Years passed since that final, unforgettable matchup. Michael Jordan had gone on to dominate the NBA in ways no one had ever imagined, cementing his place as one of the greatest to ever play the game. Championships followed championships, MVP trophies piled up, and his Air Jordan brand became a global phenomenon. He was a household name, revered for his on-court greatness and his business savvy. But for all of his success, there was one person Jordan couldn't stop thinking about, the rival who had pushed him harder than anyone else during his early years. This former opponent had faded into obscurity. Once a household name in his own right, he had slipped into the background, overshadowed by the more celebrated stars of the NBA. No one spoke of him anymore, and his accomplishments were forgotten, as if they had never existed. The player who had once been the fiercest competition for Jordan, the one who had tested him, challenged him, and made him better, had been cast aside, as though he had never mattered. Jordan, in the midst of his own career-defining moments, never forgot how his rival had pushed him to the edge. The memories of their matchups were etched into his mind. Each time they met, it wasn't just a battle for dominance, it was a battle of wills. The intensity was unmatched. But now, years later, Jordan had lost touch with the man who had once been a constant presence in his career. Jordan had risen to greatness, but his rival had, quite literally, fallen off the map. The news of his rival's passing came as a shock to Jordan. A friend of his, someone who had been involved in the league for years, reached out to share the somber news. The rival had passed away, alone, in poverty, without the recognition he deserved. The circumstances surrounding his death were tragic, and it hit Jordan harder than he expected. His rival had been forgotten, his achievements ignored, and he had spent the final years of his life in relative obscurity. The man who had once pushed Jordan to be great had ended up a footnote in history, his legacy slipping through the cracks. Jordan was stunned, but more than that, he was filled with regret. He had heard rumors over the years, rumors about his former rival's struggles. But he had never taken the time to learn the truth. Now, faced with the harsh reality that his former competitor had died without the recognition he deserved, Jordan couldn't help but feel a deep sense of guilt. He had moved on from the rivalry, from the competitive battles they had shared, but his rival hadn't. And now, it was too late to make things right. He began to reflect on their rivalry, the fierce battles they had fought against each other. Jordan remembered the intensity of those games, the feeling of being pushed to his limits every time they played. He thought about the respect he had for the player, the understanding that they both had something to prove. They were not just opponents, they were equals in many ways. In some strange, unspoken way, they had shaped each other's careers. But with his rival's passing, all that was left were the memories, the moments that had defined Jordan's early years in the NBA. Those moments had become faded memories, lost in the passage of time. Jordan felt the weight of this loss. His rival, who had been so important to him in his career, had faded into oblivion, and Jordan had never thought to do anything about it. As he sat alone in his office, the weight of the situation finally hit him. He could have done more. He could have reached out. He could have helped ensure that his rival's legacy was remembered. Jordan knew that his own success had come at the expense of many other players who had helped him along the way. He wasn't the only one who had contributed to the league's history. But for some reason, his rival's story had never been told the way it should have been. In the weeks that followed, Jordan found himself wrestling with a decision. How could he honor his fallen rival? How could he make sure that the contributions of this player, the man who had been such a significant part of his own journey, were not forgotten? After some time, the answer came to him. Jordan decided to fund a monument, a statue, dedicated to his former rival. He would place it in a park near an old court where the two of them had once played. This was a place that held significance for both men, a place where their rivalry had first taken root. It would be a fitting tribute to the legacy of a player who had pushed him to be better. The monument would not just honor his career, but it would serve as a reminder to future generations of the sacrifices and struggles that had shaped the game of basketball. Jordan's decision was met with mixed reactions. Some people saw it as a gesture of respect, a way to honor a player who had been lost in the shuffle of the league's history. Others questioned the need for such a tribute, arguing that the rival had not achieved the same level of fame or success as Jordan. But Jordan didn't care about the public's opinion. This wasn't about making headlines, this was about doing what he knew was right. His rival deserved recognition, and Jordan was going to make sure it happened. As the plans for the monument began to take shape, Jordan started speaking to people who had known his rival personally, former teammates, coaches, and friends. He learned more about his rival's life after basketball, the struggles, the financial hardships, the quiet battles that had taken place off the court. It became clear that the story of his rival was far more complex than the public had ever known. The man had fought tirelessly to maintain his dignity in the face of adversity, and in the end, he had lost that fight. But Jordan was determined to ensure that his rival's story wouldn't be forgotten. It was time for the world to know the truth. Jordan reached out to the family of his fallen rival, offering his condolences and his support. He worked with them to make sure that the monument would reflect the essence of his rival's legacy, the strength, the resilience, and the passion that had defined his career. This wasn't just a statue, it was a tribute to everything his rival had stood for, the values that had made him such a fierce competitor and a worthy adversary. The day of the unveiling arrived, and Jordan stood alongside the family and friends of the late player, ready to honor the man who had pushed him to be the best. The monument, which stood tall in the park, depicted the two players, Jordan and his rival, locked in a moment of competition, a visual representation of their rivalry. It wasn't just about basketball, it was about two men who had fought for greatness, who had challenged each other in ways no one else could. As the statue was unveiled, Jordan stepped forward and spoke. "He made me better," Jordan said, his voice filled with emotion. "Without him, I wouldn't have been who I am today. We pushed each other. And that's what made us great." The crowd fell silent, the significance of the moment settling in. Jordan had paid tribute to his rival in the most meaningful way possible. It was a tribute not just to a player, but to a man who had been overlooked, forgotten by the world. But now, thanks to Jordan's actions, his legacy would live on for generations to come. As Jordan stood there, watching the crowd gather around the monument, he realized that this was the final piece of his legacy, his own acknowledgement that the game wasn't just about him. It was about the people who had helped him along the way, the players who had pushed him, who had challenged him, who had made him better. And in honoring his rival, Jordan had finally come to understand that greatness wasn't just about being the best, it was about lifting others up, even after they were gone. The monument stood tall in the park, a permanent reminder of the legacy of the forgotten player, and a testament to the power of respect, rivalry, and the unbreakable bond forged through competition. As the monument project began to take shape, Michael Jordan found himself deep in reflection. The idea of honoring his former rival had sparked something within him, a desire not just to pay tribute, but to make a statement about the nature of greatness, rivalry, and respect. He knew that the rivalry with this player had pushed him to new heights. But over the years, he had never really considered what had happened to the man who had challenged him most. The tribute wasn't about a comeback, it was about acknowledging the role this player had in his journey and making sure that future generations knew the full story. Jordan's decision to fund the statue wasn't made lightly. It wasn't about making headlines or reclaiming lost glory, it was about righting a wrong, about ensuring the legacy of a player who had given everything to the game. He understood that this wasn't a story that had been told enough, and now it was time to do something about it. The details of the project were carefully planned. The location for the statue was set, near an old court in the heart of a park that had once been a battleground for both players. This court, where countless legends had played and where Jordan had faced this rival in numerous key matchups, seemed like the perfect place to memorialize the past. The court had witnessed their early struggles, their incredible performances, and the moments that had defined their careers. And now, it would serve as the backdrop for a tribute to a man who had helped shape Jordan's legacy, even if his own had been lost to time. Jordan didn't just want the statue to be another piece of art for fans to admire. He wanted it to tell a story of competition, of respect, and of shared history. This wasn't just a static piece of marble, it was a monument that would speak to the essence of what basketball was about, the drive to be better, to challenge those around you, and to leave everything on the court. To make the project feel genuine, Jordan wanted to incorporate elements of his former rival's career into the design. He wanted the statue to reflect the nature of their rivalry, showing them both at their peak, facing off, pushing each other to the limits of their abilities. The artist who would create the piece, a sculptor known for capturing the raw emotion of sports, worked with Jordan to ensure that the final design would encapsulate the essence of their competition. The statue would show both players locked in a fierce battle, their intensity mirrored in the way their bodies were positioned, frozen in time as if forever in the heat of the moment. But the tribute wasn't just about the rivalry itself, it was also about the man behind the competition. Jordan had learned through interviews with family and friends of his rival that this player's story was far more complex than anyone had known. While he had once been a standout on the court, his life after basketball had been filled with difficulties that no one could have imagined. Financial troubles, lack of proper support, and a struggle to adjust to life after retirement had all contributed to the player's downfall. And now, in death, he had been largely forgotten by the sports world. The fact that he had passed away alone and in poverty was a stark contrast to the loud celebrations of Jordan's own career. The more Jordan learned about his rival's later years, the more he realized that the monument was as much about human dignity as it was about basketball. It wasn't enough to simply celebrate the player's skill on the court. Jordan knew that to truly honor his rival, he had to ensure that the entire scope of his life was recognized, the struggles, the triumphs, and the years of dedication that had never been acknowledged by the world. In conversations with the rival's family, Jordan learned even more about the personal sacrifices his former opponent had made during his career. The pressure of the NBA, the public expectation, and the mental toll it took on players like them had often been ignored. The more Jordan spoke with those who had known his rival, the more he realized just how little people understood about the complexities of being a professional athlete. It wasn't just about playing the game, it was about what happened after the game was over. Jordan decided to not only fund the statue but also to create an endowment in the name of his rival. This would ensure that the player's legacy would be preserved in a way that went beyond mere remembrance. The money would go to scholarships for young athletes, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds, who dreamed of playing at the highest level but needed financial assistance. The tribute would serve as a reminder that greatness didn't just belong to those who won championships, it belonged to all those who fought for their dreams, who gave everything they had, and who, despite the odds, continued to rise. The project quickly gained momentum. Former teammates, coaches, and even fans of the rival began reaching out to offer their support. As the word spread about the monument, people began to see it not just as a tribute to a forgotten player, but as a statement about how the NBA should remember its players, both the superstars and the ones who had made significant contributions without the same recognition. As the statue's unveiling approached, Jordan began to feel a deep sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just a personal project, it was about righting a collective wrong, about reminding the world that basketball wasn't just about the players who made it big, but about all the players who had made the game what it was. He reflected on his own career, the triumphs, the accolades, the struggles, and realized that he had been lucky. He had been supported by those around him, by his teammates, by the fans, and by the league. His rival had never had that same support, and now it was time to change that. The unveiling ceremony was set to take place on a warm summer afternoon, in the park where the two players had first battled each other in front of a crowd that had no idea of the history being made that day. The location was symbolic, chosen specifically because it was a place where both men had once tested each other's skills and had pushed the boundaries of what it meant to be great. Now, it would stand as a symbol of that very spirit, competition, respect, and the desire to make each other better. Jordan had made sure that everything was perfect for the day of the ceremony. He invited the rival's family, old teammates, friends, and coaches. The people who had been closest to the rival, those who had known him before he faded from public view, gathered to celebrate the man who had been a force on the court. It wasn't just about basketball, it was about acknowledging a life, a legacy, and a story that had been overlooked for far too long. The day of the unveiling arrived. The park was full of people, all gathered to witness the tribute to a forgotten legend. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the crowd. Jordan stood at the front, facing the statue that now stood proudly in the center of the park. As the veil was lifted, the crowd fell silent. The figure of the forgotten rival was captured mid-play, locked in a moment of competition with Jordan himself. It was a powerful image, a symbol of their rivalry, their shared history, and the mutual respect that had defined their careers. As the crowd stood in awe, Jordan spoke, his voice filled with emotion. "This man made me better. Without him, I wouldn't have been who I am today. We pushed each other. And that's what made us great." The crowd erupted into applause, but for Jordan, the standing ovation wasn't just for the statue, it was for the man who had helped shape him into the player he had become. It was a fitting tribute to a forgotten player, and a reminder that greatness comes in many forms, not just the ones the world remembers. The rival may have been forgotten by most, but now, he would never be forgotten again. The day arrived for the unveiling of the monument in the park, and the atmosphere was filled with anticipation. The statue stood covered, a testament to the painstaking work that had gone into its creation. Michael Jordan, having planned this moment for months, knew that this wasn't just about honoring a forgotten rival, it was about delivering a message to the world about the true essence of competition, respect, and legacy in the world of basketball. For years, Jordan had been surrounded by the media, the accolades, the adoration. But here, in this quiet park near an old court, he was stepping into a different role. The statues that adorned arenas across the country were for players who had dominated the game, won titles, and made history. But the monument Jordan had funded was different. It wasn't for the legends who lived in the spotlight, it was for someone who had been overlooked and forgotten, even though his contribution to the game was undeniable. The rival, who had once pushed Jordan to the edge, who had forced him to work harder and play smarter, was the inspiration behind this tribute. Jordan had thought long and hard about the location of the monument. It wasn't placed in an arena or a city center, it stood in a small park near a court where the rival and Jordan had once played together in their early years. The park had once been a place where future NBA stars honed their skills, a place where legends had been made on the cracked pavement. The court might not have been polished, but the spirit of the game had lived there, and now, it would be immortalized in the form of a monument. The crowd gathered in the park, composed of former teammates, basketball fans, journalists, and the rival's family. They had all come to honor the man who had been overshadowed in the public eye, but whose importance in the basketball world could not be ignored. Jordan arrived with a sense of calm, knowing that this was a moment he had to see through. He had spent months organizing the tribute, and now it was time to share it with the world. Standing at the front, with his hands clasped in front of him, Jordan looked out over the crowd. He could see the faces of the rival's family, his wife, his children, his old friends. There was a sadness in their eyes, a quiet grief that came with the loss of someone who had never received the recognition he deserved. Jordan felt that loss too, in a way. His rivalry with the player had defined much of his own career, and it hurt him that the world had forgotten this man's story. The more Jordan learned about his rival's struggles, his battles with finances, his inability to adjust to life after basketball, the more he realized how little had been done to support players who didn't achieve the same level of fame. And now, in front of him, the legacy of his rival would be honored. The veil over the statue was lifted, and the crowd fell silent. The figure of the rival stood tall, caught mid-move, as if he was forever frozen in that moment when he and Jordan had faced off on the court. The rival's stance was powerful, his legs bent, body coiled, ready to strike. His expression, though made of stone, seemed alive with the intensity of those moments. The detail in the statue captured not just his physical form, but the essence of who he had been, a fierce competitor who had left it all on the court. As the statue was revealed, the air was thick with emotion. Jordan stepped forward to speak, and for the first time, the crowd was completely still. He wasn't the superstar, the legend that everyone knew. He was simply a man who had come to honor a player who had made him who he was. This man, Jordan began, his voice strong but filled with respect, made me better. He pushed me to be the player I am today. Without him, I wouldn't have learned what it meant to be truly great. Our battles were about more than just winning games. They were about testing each other, challenging each other, and in the process, making each other better. And for that, I am forever grateful. Jordan paused, looking over at the family of his rival. We all owe him something. He was part of the reason I was able to reach the heights I did. He tested me every time we stepped on the floor together. And that's what made him great. The crowd erupted into applause, but for Jordan, this wasn't about applause. This was about paying respect to a player who had never received the credit he deserved. The rival, who had once been in the shadow of others, was now immortalized, not just as a competitor, but as someone who had helped shape the course of the game. Jordan wasn't alone in recognizing this. As the statue was revealed, others began to speak up, too. Former teammates of both Jordan and the rival, players who had faced off against them in the league, shared their stories. They spoke about how the rivalry had pushed them all, how the competition between Jordan and his rival had been something special, something that defined an era of basketball. For the rival's family, the moment was bittersweet. They had never expected the world to recognize his worth in such a tangible way, but the gesture from Jordan gave them a sense of peace. They had lived through years of struggles, not just with his financial difficulties, but with the quiet frustration of knowing that his legacy was slipping away, unnoticed by many. Now, with the statue standing in the park, there was no denying the impact he had had on the game. The rival's story was no longer just a footnote in history. It was a legacy that would live on for generations. As the ceremony continued, Jordan took a moment to step away from the crowd. He walked over to the statue, standing in front of it with his head slightly bowed. He thought about the many times he had faced this player on the court, each moment pushing him, challenging him, making him a better player. He thought about the hours they had spent working to perfect their craft, the countless hours of preparation, the sweat, the pain, and the triumphs. They were not just opponents, they had been part of each other's journey. For Jordan, this tribute was more than just an acknowledgement of a player's career, it was a reflection of the journey they had both taken. The rivalry had shaped his career in ways he had never truly understood until now. It was a realization that greatness wasn't just about winning, it was about the people who helped you along the way, the ones who pushed you to be better, even if they didn't always get the credit they deserved. As Jordan stood in front of the monument, the wind rustling through the trees, he understood the magnitude of the moment. This wasn't just about basketball, it was about the human connection, the relationships that are built through competition, and the recognition of those who helped create the path to greatness. The ceremony ended, but Jordan stayed for a while longer, standing in front of the statue, reflecting on the past and thinking about how the future would remember not just the players who won championships, but the ones who had to fight for recognition. As the evening drew to a close and the crowd began to disperse, Jordan felt a sense of peace. The tribute had been completed, and with it, a part of basketball's history that had long been forgotten had been brought back into the light. The rival's legacy would live on, not just in the words of Jordan, but in the statue that now stood as a testament to a life spent in competition, respect, and the pursuit of greatness. The next morning, as the sun rose over the park, the statue stood tall, casting its long shadow across the court where so many of the rivalries had unfolded. It was a new day, and with it, a new chapter in the legacy of basketball. As the days passed after the unveiling, Michael Jordan found himself increasingly reflective. It wasn't just about the monument anymore, it was about the journey, the moments, the matches, and the lessons he had learned over the course of his career. The statue in the park was a fitting tribute to his fallen rival, but the impact it had on Jordan was far deeper than he had anticipated. It wasn't just about paying homage to a player who had once tested him, it was a reminder of the game itself, the players who had come before him, and those who had pushed him to be better. For Jordan, the unveiling ceremony had been the culmination of an idea that had been brewing for years. The rivalry with his former opponent had shaped his career in ways that only a few could understand. While many outside the world of basketball had written off the rivalry as just another series of games, Jordan knew the truth, that man had made him the player he was. And now, he was giving that player the recognition he deserved. But standing in front of the statue, Jordan realized something. It wasn't just about the rivalry. It wasn't just about the competition. It was about the love of the game, the unspoken bond that tied every player together, regardless of whether they were in the limelight or not. His former rival, who had once been a fixture in the NBA, had faced a series of setbacks that eventually led to his obscurity. Yet, despite all that, Jordan knew that the man had always given his all. And now, Jordan was making sure the world understood that. In the weeks following the unveiling, Jordan visited the monument several times. Each visit was quiet, reflective. There were no cameras, no crowds. It was just Jordan, alone with his thoughts. He'd sit on a nearby bench and look at the statue, remembering the moments they had shared on the court, the games, the plays, and the silent respect they had for each other. He was finally able to process the pain that had come with losing his rival, not in terms of competition, but in the way the basketball world had forgotten him. Jordan spent time speaking with people who had known his rival best. Family, former teammates, friends, each person he spoke to had a different story to tell. One of his former teammates shared a memory of how the rival had once stepped in and defended Jordan during a particularly tough matchup. He wasn't just out there playing his game, the teammate recalled. He was watching out for you, too, even if no one saw it. That's who he was. A competitor, a protector, and a friend. The more Jordan learned about his rival's later years, the more he was struck by the sense of neglect that had surrounded him. The rival had struggled to adjust to life after basketball, like so many athletes do. But unlike Jordan, who had the support of his teammates and the media's adoration, his rival had been left to fend for himself. Financial troubles, a lack of guidance, and an absence of opportunities after retirement had left him isolated. Jordan knew this wasn't just an isolated story. He realized that many players, especially those who didn't have the same fame or star power, fell through the cracks once their careers were over. While the world moved on to the next big star, these players were often left behind, with their legacies fading into the background. The realization hit Jordan hard. He had been lucky, surrounded by a support system that had helped him transition into life after basketball. His rival hadn't been so fortunate. Over time, Jordan began to feel an even greater responsibility, not just to honor his rival, but to do something about the systemic issue that had led to so many players being forgotten. He had the power to make a difference, and now, more than ever, he felt that he had to use his platform to shine a light on the issues that had affected so many of his peers. The thought of his rival's struggles weighed on Jordan, but it also fueled him. He had spent his life competing, striving for greatness, but now, he realized that greatness wasn't just about individual achievement. It was about ensuring that those who helped you along the way were remembered and supported. And his rival's story, while tragic, was just one example of the larger problem in professional sports. In one of his quiet moments at the statue, Jordan made a decision. He would use his influence to make sure the next generation of players, especially those who weren't destined to become household names, wouldn't face the same fate. He began brainstorming ideas for how he could help. Maybe it was through funding initiatives that provided financial literacy and career counseling for retiring athletes. Maybe it was by establishing a foundation that focused on the mental health and well-being of former players. Whatever the path, Jordan knew he had to do something. The loss of his rival had opened his eyes to a truth he had never fully understood. Jordan's resolve grew stronger as he continued to meet with the rival's family and friends. They shared stories of how their loved one had struggled to find purpose after basketball. Many had tried to help, but the system was flawed. There was no blueprint for what came after the final buzzer. And as Jordan listened to these stories, he began to understand the magnitude of the problem. He also began to see how much of a difference he could make. His rival's death had been a painful wake-up call, but it was also a call to action. But as much as he was moved by the pain of his rival's family and friends, there was also something deeply personal about the situation. Jordan had often wondered what would happen to him once he retired. He knew the spotlight wouldn't stay on him forever. But hearing the stories of his rival's struggles reminded him of the importance of legacy, not just in terms of what you achieve, but in how you prepare for life beyond the game. As the months went by, Jordan began speaking to other former players, some of whom were facing similar challenges. The conversations were eye-opening. It became clear to him that the issues didn't just affect players who faded into obscurity. Many of the most successful players were also struggling with life after basketball. And that was when Jordan knew his work was just beginning. While the monument was a powerful tribute, Jordan realized that his real legacy, what he would be remembered for, would not be based solely on the championships or the accolades. It would be about what he did for the players who came after him. His rival had taught him that greatness in the game of basketball wasn't just about competition, it was about lifting others up. And that lesson, once learned, would stay with Jordan forever. The idea of honoring his rival was no longer enough. Jordan had to ensure that future players didn't have to face the same struggles. The monument was just the first step. The real work lay ahead, and Michael Jordan was ready to take it on. The loss of his rival had shaken Michael Jordan in a way he hadn't anticipated. What had started as a tribute, an attempt to right the wrongs of a forgotten legacy, had now evolved into something deeper, more meaningful. As Jordan walked away from the statue in the park, the feelings of pride mixed with sadness had made him reflect not just on the career of his rival, but on the career of every NBA player whose story had been ignored after their time in the league had ended. For years, Jordan had been focused on his own path, his own accomplishments, but now he realized that he had the opportunity to help others carve a new future. He could give back in a way that went beyond just paying tribute to his fallen rival. As the days turned into weeks, Jordan spent more time talking to former players, coaches, and agents. His conversations ranged from reflective discussions about the changing landscape of the league to deep, personal insights into what happens to players once their careers ended. More and more, Jordan began to see a systemic issue within the NBA and professional sports in general. The system simply wasn't equipped to handle the transition from being a superstar athlete to navigating life after the game. And what happened to those who didn't reach superstardom? Those who spent years in the league, fighting for their spot but who, at the end of the day, were forgotten by both the fans and the system itself. The NBA was filled with former players who had sacrificed everything for the game but had been left with little support once their careers ended. Jordan found himself becoming deeply involved in these conversations, trying to find ways he could make a real difference. He spoke with his former teammates, coaches, and even other prominent figures in basketball who had seen the issue firsthand. While some brushed it off as an inevitable part of sports, others shared Jordan's growing concern. But there was one thing all of them agreed on: something needed to be done. Jordan knew his rival's story was just one example of a larger, more troubling issue. The reality was that many former NBA players struggled after retirement. Whether it was due to financial instability, mental health challenges, or the feeling of losing purpose after leaving the game, the situation was widespread. Jordan began speaking with experts in sports psychology, financial planning, and post-career transition programs, realizing that there was a massive gap in the resources available to players once they hung up their jerseys. It wasn't long before Jordan decided that he would use his platform to address this issue head-on. He didn't just want to help his fallen rival's family, he wanted to create an initiative that would provide lasting change for players facing similar struggles. His rival's story had become a turning point, pushing Jordan to think beyond his own legacy and consider the legacy of those who helped him get to where he was. He had been the beneficiary of a successful career, financial stability, and endless opportunities. But not everyone was so lucky. Jordan's vision began to take shape. He wanted to create a foundation, one that would focus on helping retired athletes, particularly those from the NBA, navigate the challenges of life after basketball. The foundation would offer financial literacy programs, career counseling, and access to mental health resources. It would also work to provide athletes with tools to transition into new careers once they were done playing the game. But Jordan knew that the work couldn't stop there. He needed to make sure the issue was brought into the public conversation, that the entire industry took note of the systemic problems that existed. The idea of the foundation quickly grew beyond Jordan's personal interest. He reached out to other NBA players, especially those who had faced their own post-career struggles. Some had been financially stable, but many hadn't. Some had moved on to new careers with ease, while others had struggled to find purpose after their playing days. As Jordan spoke to these players, it became clear that there was a shared experience, a collective realization that the system had failed them when it came to life after basketball. With support from former players like Charles Barkley, Magic Johnson, and even Larry Bird, Jordan's foundation began to take form. They would pool their resources, knowledge, and connections to create a program designed to help former athletes transition into new careers, deal with the mental health challenges that often arose after retirement, and gain access to the financial planning that so many had missed out on. They would work together to ensure that the stories of former players who had been forgotten were no longer ignored, and that future players wouldn't be left in the dark when their careers ended. Jordan used his influence to bring attention to the cause. He appeared on talk shows, gave interviews, and used social media to raise awareness about the issues facing retired athletes. He made it clear that this was no longer about him. This was about the players who had sacrificed their bodies and minds for the game and who now had to navigate a world that didn't offer the support they needed. But while Jordan worked to build his foundation, he couldn't forget the more personal aspect of the journey, the need to ensure his former rival's legacy was never forgotten again. The statue in the park was just the beginning. He knew that honoring the man's memory in this way was important, but there had to be more. Jordan decided to set up a scholarship fund in his rival's name, one that would provide opportunities for underprivileged youth who dreamed of playing basketball. The scholarship would be open to athletes who showed the same determination, work ethic, and heart that his rival had shown throughout his career. Jordan met with the rival's family to discuss this next step. The idea of the scholarship resonated deeply with them. It was a way to continue the legacy of their loved one, to give others the opportunities he had never fully received. For Jordan, this was personal. The rivalry had shaped who he was, and now, by funding the scholarship and foundation, he was shaping the next generation of players, giving them the tools to succeed both on and off the court. As the foundation began to take root, Jordan found himself more and more immersed in its mission. It wasn't just about funding programs or raising awareness. It was about changing the culture of professional sports, ensuring that athletes understood that their careers didn't end when they retired. It was about providing them with the resources to navigate life after basketball, helping them understand their financial options, providing career counseling, and offering support for mental health. It was about ensuring that the next generation of athletes would have the chance to build a lasting legacy that went beyond the game itself. Jordan's commitment to this cause was unwavering. He had always been driven by the desire to be the best, but now he understood that true greatness wasn't just about winning titles, it was about using your platform to create real, lasting change. And through his foundation, his scholarship fund, and his work to raise awareness about the challenges faced by retired athletes, Jordan had found a new purpose. He wasn't just the greatest basketball player of all time, he was a man who understood the power of giving back, of ensuring that the next generation didn't have to face the same struggles his fallen rival had faced. As the foundation grew, Jordan began to see the impact of his work. Former athletes who had once struggled to find their footing after retirement were now thriving in new careers. Young athletes were benefiting from the scholarship fund, and many were inspired by the story of the rivalry that had defined Jordan's early years. The once-forgotten player had, in death, become a symbol of the challenges every athlete faces when the spotlight fades. And thanks to Jordan's commitment, that player's legacy would live on, not just in the park, but in the lives of future generations who would be given the tools to succeed long after their careers ended. Jordan knew the work was far from over. But as he stood in front of the statue once more, he felt a sense of peace. His rival's legacy had been honored in the way it deserved. And with every life the foundation touched, Jordan knew he was helping to create a legacy that would last long after his own time in the game. As the months passed, Michael Jordan's vision for his former rival's legacy slowly took shape. What had started as a simple gesture, funding a monument in a park to honor a player whose greatness had been overshadowed, grew into something far greater. The unveiling of the statue was only the first step in a journey that would ultimately redefine how basketball viewed its retired players. Jordan's foundation was now operating in full swing, creating programs designed to help former athletes transition into the next stages of their lives. The effort was being led by a team of experts Jordan had assembled: financial advisors, mental health professionals, career counselors, and former players who had struggled with their own transitions. They worked to provide education, support, and resources to retired athletes who had once lived in the spotlight, only to fade into obscurity when their playing days were over. The foundation's mission was simple: to help former athletes navigate life after basketball. It wasn't just about financial security, it was about giving athletes the tools to rebuild their lives and careers. Many players, especially those without long or storied careers, were often left with little more than their memories. The foundation was working to ensure that these athletes didn't have to go through the same struggles that Jordan's late rival had experienced. As the foundation continued to grow, Jordan realized just how much impact it was having. Former players who had faced similar difficulties were now receiving the support they needed. The foundation wasn't just handing out money, it was offering a lifeline, guidance, counseling, and a path to success outside of basketball. Jordan felt a sense of pride as he saw the ripple effects of his decision to step forward and help those who had come after him. But even as the foundation flourished, Jordan knew that it wasn't enough to just focus on the present. He wanted to ensure that the culture of the NBA and professional sports changed for the better. He wanted future generations of players to understand that their careers were more than just a collection of games, stats, and championships. The real legacy, he realized, wasn't just about the moments captured on the court. It was about what players did once they left the court. Jordan's involvement in the foundation grew even deeper as he began to speak more openly about his rival's story. The media coverage of the foundation and its impact helped shift the conversation around retired athletes. Jordan, who had spent much of his career as the subject of countless headlines, was now using his voice to amplify the stories of those who had been left behind. He appeared on talk shows, in interviews, and at fundraisers, sharing not just his own journey, but the journeys of countless others who had played the game with pride and passion. Despite his growing success in helping others, Jordan couldn't escape the quiet moments of reflection. Every time he visited the statue of his rival, he felt a deep connection to the player he had once competed against. It wasn't just about remembering their rivalry, it was about remembering that this was a man who had given everything to the game, only to be forgotten in the end. Jordan often found himself standing before the statue, thinking about how far he had come and how little he had known about the struggles his rival had faced. On one of his visits to the statue, Jordan sat alone on the bench nearby, contemplating the impact of his efforts. The park was quiet, with only a few people walking by. In the distance, children were playing basketball on the same court where he and his rival had once faced off. Jordan smiled to himself. It was in these moments, with the cool breeze on his face and the sounds of the game in the air, that he felt at peace with the work he had done. But peace didn't mean complacency. Jordan knew there was more work to be done. The foundation had already started helping former players, but there were still so many others who hadn't received the help they needed. As his connection to the cause deepened, Jordan began pushing harder to expand the foundation's reach, raising awareness among the broader public about the struggles that athletes faced after retirement. He also started working with the NBA itself. While the league had made strides in offering post-career support, Jordan knew it could do more. He started speaking with league executives about creating a long-term, sustainable model for helping players transition into life after basketball. The conversations weren't easy. Old systems and structures are hard to change. But Jordan's influence and the success of his foundation made the conversation unavoidable. The foundation was a model for what could be achieved when the right resources were put in place. Jordan was determined to make sure that future generations of players wouldn't face the same struggles as his rival had. Months later, the NBA announced a partnership with Jordan's foundation to implement new programs aimed at helping retiring players adjust to life beyond the sport. The programs would include financial literacy workshops, mental health counseling, and career counseling, among other resources. For Jordan, this was a milestone. It wasn't just about helping former players, it was about changing the culture within the league. The work he had started with the monument was now becoming a movement that was bigger than himself. At the heart of it all was the memory of his rival. The statue stood as a testament to the idea that every player mattered, no matter their status or fame. It wasn't just about the big names, the superstars who lit up the court, it was about every player who had ever laced up their shoes and given their all for the game. Jordan's efforts had reminded the world that greatness wasn't just defined by championships and MVPs. It was also about the quiet contributions, the unseen sacrifices, and the determination to push through challenges, both on and off the court. As Jordan continued to reflect on the impact of the monument and the foundation, he realized that this was the legacy he wanted to leave behind. It wasn't just about his individual accolades or the records he had set. It was about using his platform to elevate others, to ensure that future generations of athletes were supported and that their stories were told, no matter how small or forgotten they might seem. In honoring his rival, Jordan had learned that the true measure of greatness was how you used your success to help others. Years later, when Jordan retired for the second time, the impact of the foundation was undeniable. The programs he had helped put in place were thriving, and the conversation about post-career support for athletes had evolved. Players no longer had to face the uncertainty and struggles that had once plagued so many of their predecessors. Jordan had changed the conversation. And, more importantly, he had ensured that the players who had helped him along the way would never be forgotten again. The statue of his rival stood tall in the park, a permanent reminder of the fierce battles they had fought and the respect they had for one another. As Jordan stood before it once more, he knew that the legacy he had built was not just about basketball. It was about making the game better for everyone who had ever played it. And in doing so, he had ensured that the story of his rival, of the player who had made him better, would live on for generations to come. The work was far from over, but Jordan had finally found his purpose. Through his foundation, his advocacy for retired players, and the monument that honored a forgotten rival, he had created a lasting impact on the game of basketball. And as the sun set over the park, casting long shadows on the court, Jordan knew that this was the legacy he had always wanted to leave behind, a legacy of respect, of competition, and of lifting others up in the face of adversity. The years had passed quickly. Michael Jordan's life after basketball had been filled with new challenges, new endeavors, and a purpose that he hadn't fully understood until much later in his career. The work he'd done to honor his fallen rival, through the monument, the foundation, and the widespread changes he had helped implement within the NBA had evolved into something far greater than a simple act of remembrance. It had become a movement, one that had reshaped the way the league and the world viewed athletes after their playing days ended. Jordan sat in his office, his thoughts drifting to the park where the statue of his rival stood. It had been years since the unveiling, but the feeling that day still resonated deeply within him. The roar of the crowd, the looks of awe and respect on the faces of his former rival's family, it all felt like a turning point in his own journey, one that had not only been about basketball, but about understanding what true legacy meant. As much as the championships and accolades had defined him, it was the quiet moments of giving back, of recognizing the unsung heroes, that had made all the difference. The foundation, which had once been an idea born from the sadness of losing his rival, was now thriving. More former players were receiving the support they needed during their transition out of the game, ensuring that their post-career journeys weren't marked by struggle or neglect. Jordan had spent countless hours working with former NBA players, helping to create opportunities for those who had once been forgotten by the system. The financial literacy programs, mental health initiatives, and career counseling resources were changing lives, and it felt like the league was finally beginning to shift its perspective on what it meant to be a retired athlete. But there was still work to be done. Jordan knew that the foundation needed to expand, and that the work of uplifting former athletes wasn't a one-time effort, it was a continual process. As he looked out of the window of his office, the weight of his responsibility was clear. This was his true legacy. Not the endless championships, not the shoes that bore his name, but the lives that had been touched and changed through his efforts to uplift others. The foundation wasn't just about his former rival anymore. It had become a symbol of the realization that every player, regardless of their fame, had a story to tell. Jordan understood that his rival's story was one of many that had been lost in the annals of basketball history. But now, through his efforts, more players were being given the recognition and support they deserved. The statue, the scholarships, the programs, they all symbolized the importance of honoring everyone who had contributed to the game, not just the superstars. Jordan hadn't just changed the conversation around retired athletes, he had changed the culture of basketball. No longer were players treated like commodities that were discarded once their playing days were over. Through his foundation, the NBA had become a place where players were prepared for life after basketball, supported through their transitions, and celebrated for their contributions to the game, no matter their career arc. The league, the fans, and the world had learned that greatness didn't stop when the final buzzer rang, it lived on in the work done to ensure others succeeded. One afternoon, Jordan received a letter from the family of his late rival. It was a simple letter, but it carried immense weight. The family expressed their gratitude for everything Jordan had done, not just for the statue and the foundation, but for the impact he had made on their loved one's life. They had never known just how much their relative had meant to Jordan, how deeply he had affected the course of his career. In their words, Jordan's tribute had given them a sense of peace, knowing that their loved one's legacy had been honored in such a profound way. They also thanked Jordan for giving other athletes the opportunity to succeed after basketball, for giving them hope that life after the game could be as meaningful as the time spent on the court. Reading the letter, Jordan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. It wasn't just about honoring his rival anymore, it was about ensuring that future generations of athletes wouldn't face the same struggles. His efforts had changed the landscape of the sport, and the impact was being felt far beyond what he had ever anticipated. In the years that followed, Jordan continued to visit the monument. Each visit brought new thoughts, new reflections, and a sense of pride that grew deeper as the years passed. He had created something lasting, something that would outlive him. The rivalry that had once defined his career was now part of the very fabric of basketball history, not just because of the games they played, but because of the way their story had shaped the future of the game. The foundation continued to grow, offering more resources, reaching more former athletes, and expanding its reach globally. Jordan's involvement didn't diminish. Instead, he found new ways to support and amplify the efforts. His name, once synonymous with basketball excellence, was now linked to a broader purpose, making the game better for everyone who had ever played it. As Jordan entered his later years, he began to look at the legacy he had built in a different light. It wasn't just about what he had accomplished in the NBA or how many titles he had won. It was about the people he had helped along the way, the players who had been given the tools to thrive after their careers, the children who had received scholarships, the countless lives changed through his efforts. The recognition he had once sought had been replaced by a deeper understanding of what mattered most, the impact he had on others. One last visit to the park, now years after the unveiling, found Jordan standing alone in front of the statue. The sun was setting, casting a soft orange light over the court. Children played in the distance, their laughter echoing through the park. Jordan stood there, looking at the statue of his rival. He had once stood in the same spot, feeling the weight of the rivalry. Now, as he gazed at the figure of the man who had made him better, he realized that the rivalry had never really been about who won. It had always been about the journey, about the shared struggle, and about the respect forged in the heat of competition. The story of his rival had been told. The legacy that had been forgotten had been resurrected, not just in the form of a statue, but in the lives of those who had been inspired by his story. Jordan's own legacy was now complete, not because of the rings or the accolades, but because he had given back. He had taken the lessons learned through his career and used them to shape a future where players weren't forgotten, where their contributions were celebrated, and where their lives after basketball could be as rich and meaningful as the moments spent on the court. As Jordan turned to walk away from the statue for the last time, he felt at peace. The legacy of both his rival and himself would live on, not just in the trophies or the highlights, but in the hearts of those who had been touched by the change they had created together. The story had come full circle, and Jordan knew that this was a legacy worth leaving behind.